Hello everybody, Mark Blumhardt here, founder and CEO of Boulder & Co. Creative Studio. Today's episode is how to lead and manage millennials. And again, with a couple different things that I work on, I imagine these are going to be multiple parts to this. So this is going to be part one, how to manage and lead, or I should say lead and manage millennials. And let me back up for a second, right? Let me tell you who I am. I do have an MA, so a master's degree in leadership, and a PhD in leadership too. So when I'm saying that, I'm not just saying, hey, I know everything, but I'm coming from a very, very deep, founded, rooted, grounded base of academic research, okay? This is not the forum for this to get deep into the academics, but trust me, I can. And so what I want to do is talk about something that's really kind of heavy in the news, talking about the millennials, this new generation, and what do we do with them? And so I would like to start and take this episode to just back up for a second, folks. Okay? Just stop for a second. I don't hear almost anything out there that is addressing this issue as the way it should be. And there's going to be multiple episodes to this. So the first one's setting a foundation of the way I look at the millennials. The problem is with these generations is that almost every single generation that has passed, the generation in front of them, looked down and scorned them. Think about it. Almost every single one of them. You take it back to the Industrial Revolution, for example. You had a bunch of young people turn of the century, a bunch of young people, they're sitting there on farms, and they want something different. And literally for the first time in their life, they were able to lay hold of something different. So they pack up their belongings, they say goodbye to their mom and dad, they leave the farm, and they go to the big city. And so you can imagine these farmers and everybody else is going like, oh my goodness, we're going to lose our way of life. We're going to evolve. Well, yeah, that's going to happen. But that's just life. These young people have to find their way in the world, and the way they chose back in the Industrial Revolution was to go to a big, exciting city. They didn't care if they worked in a factory for, 15 hours a day. They wanted something different. They didn't want to stay on the farm their whole life. So what are you going to do, beg them to stay? Just let them go. And you can just see these generations after generation after generation. Every single one was different than one before. That's the sign of a generation. So if you've got it different, then the one in front of them will look back and be like, oh my goodness, you're so different. You're going to ruin our way of life. How are you going to survive? And it's no different now. You think that, you go into, let's say, World War I, World War II, you've got the roaring 20s, you can imagine the older generation, wow, this is just a party crowd. They need to be home. They need to be getting ready for the winter. They need to till the land. And these guys are out there just partying like there's no tomorrow. And then World War II comes. America comes out there and basically, honestly saves the world from evil powers, so there's something good. Comes back and, they settle down, and you got Pleasantville, 1940s, 1950s. You got these communities, just perfect, idyllic. These people saw the war. They want nothing to do with it. So now they want something quiet and peaceful. They want Pleasantville, okay? And so you got your, goes into the 60s, and you got, the men going off to work, and the women are home, and they're, taking care of the children. They got the pot roast, in the evening, and the husband's wearing the black suit and the black tie, and comes home, smokes a cigarette or smokes his pipe, and eats with the family, reads his newspaper. That's Pleasantville. And then you got the 70s and, you got the 60s and 70s, and these kids are like, we want nothing to do with that. The world's not perfect. We've got social unrest, we've got civil injustices. We've got to go out there, we got to picket signs, and we got to find our own way. Drugs, sex, rock and roll, the whole 9 yards. So you can imagine the parents that are living in the 50s and the 40s, they're looking at the kids in the 60s and 70s going like, wow, we've completely lost a generation here. These guys are completely clueless. I mean, they're going to ruin our way of life. Don't you see the pattern there? So they go out and they're fighting for their social justice and everything else like that, and that's there. Then you got the 70s and 80s, and you got a completely another whiplash. They don't want the beads, and they don't want the hippie clothing, and, blah, blah, blah. They just want something more stable. Then you had the era of the big brands, the Polos of the world, and the Nikes and the Adidas, and, the lacrosse, and all the big names, the big labels that came out. Abercrombie and Fitch, just on and on and on. The 80s and the 90s. And then now you've got these students. So those kids, if you will, that grew up on the big labels, they kind of grew up and they had kids. And those kids are now the kids of the generation that you're looking at. And those kids are looking back going like, whoa. But these kids want something different. They don't want the big house. They want a tiny house. They don't want the corporate job, 9 to 5. They want to travel. Like, what's so wrong about that? The problem with the conversation that's happening right now is it starts off on the wrong foundation. They're looking at these kids and they're looking at this generation going like, these guys are a mess. They're lost. What can we do? How can we lead them? Like, oh my goodness. But it's a pattern that's happened again and again and again. So these kids are out there living van lives and they're hiking and they're traveling the world. They want more experiences. They don't care about the big labels. Like almost all our kids, like I've got 4 kids, almost all of them, they don't shop the big labels. They go to the Goodwills and the thrift stores like all their friends. They actually don't care. They rather spend that money on coffee, on traveling, on experiences, seeing the big world. That's their generation. And who knows what will happen? My prediction is they'll run this and, they'll see the big world and, then they'll end up having kids and those kids will be like, I just want something a little bit more secure, and then they'll go back to the big houses. They will want the Pleasantvilles. They will want something more secure. That's all it is. That's all it is. Stop making a big deal of it and stop thinking that there's something wrong with this generation. Somebody thought there was something wrong with your generation and somebody thought there was something wrong with my generation. Like, don't you see the pattern? Can't we just accept these people for who they are with the hope and the expectation that something great's going to come out of their life? Can't we start the conversations like that? It doesn't mean that you completely change absolutely everything about your corporation. With us, our work, our company's founded on the backs of a younger generation. Like, what do we do with that? I think it's really, really clear. Again, I'm not into begging. So if somebody wants to leave, if they're unhappy here, then they can just go. Like, I can't change my entire company in order to suit 1 or 2, 3, 4 people. I got a company to run. But you got to do that gently in the hope that these people are going to live this incredible life that's going to be completely different than the life I've lived. And Godspeed to them. I wish you the best. Please stay safe out there and just realize your full potential. Trust me on this one. You got to go. It's not for you. It's not for us. It's not for the company. You got to go. All right? I will find somebody else for the corporation. I will find somebody else that'll fill your place. No problem. So instead of trying to sit there and beg and create all these differences, so the company's like, we got a little exception here, a little exception there, a little exception there, blah, blah, blah. Then what happens is you've lost your brand. Every organization should have a brand, right or wrong. So I live in Ohio. Everybody around here is Buckeyes, right? So if you're a Buckeye, then that means you don't like Michigan. And if you're from Michigan, the state of North, you don't like the Buckeyes. Doesn't mean you're a good person, a bad person. Doesn't mean you're right or wrong. It's just a brand. And when I look at organizations, it's the same way. So this organization works for you. And if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't mean that you're bad. And just find another organization. You got to find your own tribe. And you might be able to find an organization that allows you to travel and everything else. Okay? That's great. I hope you do. But unfortunately, with us, we're not set up that way. To be perfectly honest, our corporation, we need to have everybody sitting in pretty much every day because we're dealing with huge client issues all the time. I can't have somebody remote working in Idaho. I need to have a face-to-face with that person. Say, hey, wait a minute. Have you thought about this? Like, oh, no. So we're results-orientated. We don't know. We're sailing uncharted waters all the time. We don't know what the questions are, and we certainly don't know what the answers are. So I need everybody, more or less, in the office here thinking about the same problems and issues that I'm facing and that our clients are facing. So having said that, though, if I understand that there's really absolutely nothing wrong with the younger generation, then we can have those conversations. But right now, everybody looks at the younger generation and they just assume that something's wrong with them. They just assume that nothing's going to come out of their life. They just assume that they're going to ruin their way of life. They just assume that something negative is going to happen. Why? Can you just stop and look at this younger generation with all the hope that they have? These guys will make, you know what, let me tell you this. I'm going to rant and rave here. If you look at the Dark Ages, you know what happened with the Dark Ages? People hear about the Dark Ages, blah, blah, blah. What happened with the Dark Ages was that the water was so contaminated. You had the Black Plague. This Black Plague killed like a third of the people. And after a while, these people realized, hey, if I drink this water, I'll probably die. Now, rats and everything else was included and everything. Don't get me wrong. But people realized in order to survive, they had to drink something else besides water. The water was that contaminated. I mean, it was going through the canals and, rats were getting in it, dead bodies and everything else. People were dying literally by a third. So if we were in Ohio, for example, there's like 15, 16 million people in Ohio. That means that 5 million people in Ohio alone would die. Like you couldn't dig graves fast enough to bury these people, okay? So that was the Black Plague. And during that time, people realized, hey, if we drink something called mead, or basically beer, like, it's fermented, so it's got its own, antibacterial, properties. If we drank that, we would stay alive. And so everybody was drinking mead and they were drinking beer, in pubs and everything else like that. So from the moment you woke up to the moment you fell asleep, people were drinking. They were drunk. They lived in this perpetual state of stupor. Like literally their lives were just completely zombied out, right? Those were the Dark Ages. And so during that time, they were the Crusades and everything else like that. They would take their ships from Europe and they would, go through the, Indian Ocean. That's where you got IPA, Indian Pale Ale. And it was basically just had these big barrels of ale that they drank because that's about the only thing they could drink. Everybody was drunk all the time. And so if you're drunk, it's a depressant. You're just sitting there and you're kind of slowing down. So what happened was, as these ships go out to the west and they go on their crusades, they ran into something amazing. It was called coffee and tea. And coffee and tea has caffeine. And in order to drink coffee and tea, you have to boil it. And if you boil it, then that means your water's not contaminated anymore. So guess what happened? They take this coffee and they bring it back to Europe and they start these coffee shops. Like, isn't this amazing how the world works? So they bring the coffee back, they start boiling the coffee, they realize, hey, if I drink the coffee, I'm not gonna die because it's, they didn't really realize what was going on, but they were like, that's something else they can drink. So they started drinking this stuff called coffee. Well, guess what happens when you drink coffee? You get amped up, like instead of the depressant. So you had the whole world completely zoned out on alcohol and ale. Then all of a sudden you introduce coffee. Then all of a sudden everybody basically woke up. It was called the Enlightenment. Then all of a sudden they went to these coffee shops and they would sit there and they'd drink their coffee and they'd just get completely wired. They'd never experienced something like this before. And in those moments, in those coffee centers, they started having these conversations. They started talking about meaningful things. So instead of just blindly getting on a ship and just going out west to kill people because they weren't Christians, they started talking. They were like, hey, why do we do that? And they started talking about all these really, really important topics about governing, and they were talking about, the world and on, mathematics and just you name it, medicine, absolutely everything else like that. That was a time called the Enlightenment because they had these conversations. These conversations were stimulated by something called caffeine. Now, where am I going with this? Think about our generation now. I swear to you, and I wish I could collect on this bet, in 100 years, historians will look back at this new generation and say it was an era of enlightenment. Think about that. So all you guys sitting out there thinking that it's doom and gloom, and this younger generations that's on their iPads and everything else like that, and their iPhones, what's going to happen with them? I'm telling you, mark my words, in 100 years, the historians will say it was an era of enlightenment. Think about that. So instead of the coffee shop and the caffeine that we're having these conversations, yeah, we have coffee shops now, people having conversations, but the vehicle for that are these electronic devices. That we are all able to have conversations with a click of the mouse. We're able to have conversations with anybody and everybody that's interested in the same topic, for good or bad. It just made the world flat. And because of those conversations, just like the Dark Ages, it's going to give us enlightenment, and it's going to have these conversations. People are going to start connecting the dots more and more and more and more. You can see it all over the place. It's already happening. They're connecting dots, and then you can imagine this whole era is going to be this Dark Ages. I don't know what it's going to look like. Just like everybody in the Dark Ages didn't know what the era of enlightenment was going to be. So we don't know what it's going to be. But mark my words. Instead of sitting there doom and gloom, thinking that everything's wrong with society, everything's wrong with this generation, why don't we look at them with all the hope in our hearts and wish them all the best? And just sit back and watch what will happen with their lives. How exciting is that? Isn't it so much better to look at them that way? To sit there and then look at them just like this, this obligation, this weight on society that everybody's talking about? Come on. Give these people a break. Give these people a break that you and I needed. Give these people a break. Give these people hope. Give these people this faith that something's going to happen with their lives. Isn't that a better way to live? Isn't that a better way to start those conversations? Come on. Anyways, that's it.